you. So let me just go straight to the points. With the case of the banking sector, we had a receiver. And I want to know with the Securities and Exchange Commission, did we have a receiver? I know we had something with the Registrar General.
Yeah, so I want to draw your attention to the fact that we operate under Act 929, the Securities Industry Act, Act 929, which is different from the Bank of Ghana Act. And in our framework, it doesn't give us the powers to appoint a receiver. So our process following the revocation was to inform the official liquidator, who is also the Registrar General, about the revocation. And then she then applies to the court to seek for the liquidation of these firms. So that is the process. So ours goes through the court process even after revocation. And in the court process, the outcome of that is the liquidation of these firms.
Okay.
So that's important and is important to note, because that process is also on notice.
Okay.
So we have to find the directors of these firms and serve them with notice of liquidation of their firms.
Okay.
Or serve them with notice of the petition to liquidate.
So when you revoke their licenses, you have to serve them a petition that you want to liquidate their assets.
Yes.
Okay, so that's the process you go through. How long does it take?
So I think because it's also subject to the court timelines.
Okay.
When we did the revocation, we started the process, but obviously with the impact of COVID-19, and then the court also has its own timelines, and the court's schedule is also pushed back to allow for social distance, and that's taken some time, and that's not really in our hands. The full liquidation process it depends on the kinds of assets available and what can be disposed of. But if you recall, when we announced the revocation, we also indicated that government had committed some level of resources. At the time of the revocation, when they did the budget last year, about 1.5 billion had been dedicated to the budget. But we are in talks with government to review that, because the claims that we have received far exceed even the assets that we had been informed of.
How much in terms of amount claims
so
you've received?
The early claims we received were about 12.5 billion.
12.5 billion?
Yes. Against
cedis?
Cedis.
Okay.
Cedis.
And when you look at the claims you've received and you're looking at the assets, and if you're considering if you should, sell the assets, or how much are you going to get from it?
So the assets that they had reported to us was about 8 billion.
8 billion
cedis. Yes.
Okay, and then the whatever you've received is 12 the claims is 12.6 billion.
Yes.
Okay. So
but let me address the reason why this was taking quite a while as well.
Okay.
So when we did the revocation, we told people to also file their claims with us.
Right.
So that claims process happened over a 2-month period, but we are still receiving claims. Okay. We set up a hotline as well for people to call. And just for the purpose of this call, I'll just re-emphasize 0800 100 065. And also, if they haven't received acknowledgement of their claims, they could send an email to revocations@sec.gov.gh.
Revocations@sec.gov.gh. Okay.
They could also send emails to info@sec.gov.gh. Okay. Now, let me explain how the process works, which is why I thought it's taking time. I think that's people's concerns.
Yes, it's been 7 months.
What we needed to do, there are almost 3 levels of validation. One is to look at the system balances of the firms affected and match it against the claims we have received. Now, sometimes you might find that what somebody's claiming to have, the firm is not reflecting it in their systems. When we find such disparities, then we also have to go to the source documents, which are the manual documents that the fund manager has to do their operations. Obviously, some of that will involve bringing in their staff to help us with that. And if you recall, some of the firms had even closed shop. So it means you have to trace people who used to work at those firms to come in and let us know their customers, who their customers were, where their files are located, and even going through some of that exercise. There's also a third step. When we haven't been able to resolve some of the disparities from those 2 approaches, we will also invite some of the investors. So if we find that in the system, your claims were 20,000, but what you filed is 50,000, we will have to rectify that or address the gap. Sometimes what we found was that there were some erroneous claims. So even as we speak, one claim was about 1.4 billion.
1.4 billion from just one person?
From just one person. And it turned out it was an error. wasn't filed properly.
Okay.
So there are instances like that where we have to address before we even start paying out. And so that's critical.
So you haven't made any payments at all?
No, we haven't.
What's delaying? What's the challenge?
So I mentioned earlier on that government had made a commitment of 1.5 billion. Now, we also have to do the validation. And then we also were trying to make some progress on the court processes. So unfortunately, the court processes also have constrained us in terms of getting the liquidation orders. But then the pandemic...
Because if you don't have the liquidation orders verified and approved, you can't go ahead liquidating the assets.
Exactly.
And if you don't liquidate the assets, you can't make payments.
So the liquidation would be the second form of payment.
Okay.
But the first form of payment that we are exploring is for government to come in with a bailout.
Okay. But you mentioned that government had made a commitment of 1.5 billion. So
yes.
Has it been given to you already? It's just a commitment?
It's a commitment for now.
Okay.
So we are discussing with government the modalities around the payout and then the structure that will be used to implement it. So given that we don't operate like the banking sector, government will have to obviously take over or look at how it approaches our sector in a way that is relevant and supports the sector effectively as well. I think the challenge in terms of our process is the validation. Going through the systems, going through the records, making sure that the figures that we have reflect that. The 8 billion I mentioned obviously included some pension assets. So the gap that we see is a bit bigger than that.
Okay. Okay, so let's look at, I know, what's the state really? I think most of the concerns you have had are people who have their investment locked up at Gold Coast fund managers. What's the latest on that? I know they filed, they went to court. Is it still in court? So
we actually had some firms appeal the decision of the commission.
And through court and stamped through your committee?
Exactly, exactly. So those on the committee has finished its hearings. It's made decisions. But if you will bear in mind, the process is such that once the committee makes a decision, people who are still not satisfied with that can apply to court for an appeal of the decision as well. So that's something to bear in mind. But at least the committee's work is finished. Those who went to court, one of them actually withdrew their contest. So we can still proceed with the process.
But what happens to people whose funds are locked up with Gold Coast, for instance, because the matter is in court? So it means that they cannot access their funds until the court hears the case and gives a go ahead.
For Gold Coast, they were in the AHC.
Okay, what's AHC?
Administrative Hearings Committee.
Okay.
I don't want to delve too much into that
because it's in court.
But it's a process that will
we'll
make an announcement on that shortly.
Okay.
But as I mentioned earlier, the firms also have options to exercise coming out of that process. There is the challenge of them frustrating the process, the bailout process, because if you have that, the question becomes, how do you make a payout on the back of that? But again, this is government social intervention.
Okay.
So what would be happening is that investors may assign their interest to government. Then government gives them something while the process continues. But that's something that we are working out with government. And ideally, you want a clean process. So that's something that we have to resolve. And that's also what will make us progress in terms of the bailout framework we introduced. But we'll make an announcement on that in the next few weeks. Okay,
but do investors have to wait for the liquidation process to terminate before receiving payments?
The framework we are discussing with government involves giving some level of payment before the liquidation process terminates.
Okay.
Because liquidation can take anywhere from 2 to 4 years.
Which is some relief.
Yes, exactly. So make some relief available to investors in this current fiscal year. And then subsequently, when the liquidations occur, if additional resources are released into the vehicle that we use, investors can tap into that as well.
So what happens to clients whose appeals have gone through and those that are pending? What happens to them? What's their fate?
So for those that we allow to resume, they will... I think we had some basis for allowing for that. Some of them we're actually going to put on suspension, so they can't mobilize new funds. They also address some of the issues that were raised, and then from there, but they have we are convinced, or we've been informed of the ability to also meet clients' requirements. So we'll make an announcement on that as well.
You announced some time ago that there was going to be some cap in terms of support from government.
Yes.
Do we know? Now?
I think that's also why getting the claims was important.
Okay.
And then validating those claims. So the cap really was about what level of, I would say, early relief government can provide to investors pending the process. We have a sense of the range. I cannot communicate on that now, but it's something that we are keeping in mind, given the challenges people are facing and given the kind of economic environment we find ourselves in. Obviously, government is also constrained because of the COVID-19 impact on the economy and on its finances. But we are also aware that supporting the capital markets is a big priority for government. And this intervention will help because some of the investors are also holding funds for other groups. So you have provident funds, you have corporate institutions, you have some social groups also having their funds exposed in this framework.
So are there for instance some relief or special arrangements for people like pensioners and what have you, like in terms of payments? I'll be asking you soon for you to tell us how many people or when we are supposed to start receiving payments. I don't know if you have a date of when we are supposed to start receiving payments, but I mean there should be some arrangement, special arrangement for pensioners. Whether or not their case is still in court or not, there are concerns that there should be some arrangements for them. Do you agree?
So I think some of these issues have been brought to our attention. We are looking at the numbers around it. Because again, if we set the cap at a level that satisfies the bulk of affected persons, that's a reasonable place to start.
Okay.
And then from there, once they have a framework that gives them some liquidity, and that's really important, that they have access to funds beyond the first tranche or the first level of support.
Yeah, but is there any justification for that? Because people whose licenses were revoked, I mean, people whose funds were locked up in the banking sector, they are having full payment. And with the Securities and Exchange Commission, you're saying there should be a cap. Is there any justification for that?
I think some of those announcements also were made before the president's statement to reinstate. But I think there's also a difference to note. If you look at the process we have to follow compared to the banking sector, when you take your funds to the bank, it depends on the assets class. But for the banks, they're doing fixed deposits normally. You can also buy treasury bills through the bank. It's a guaranteed return. And so to the extent where there's a default, you have an issue. With fund managers, ideally, you should be investing on a risk-based approach, right? So if you go there and you are doing risk-free instruments, let's say you're buying treasury bills through them, or you're buying certain instruments, bank deposits through them, that has a certain risk profile.
Yeah.
And so you get a return based on the portfolio. If you go there and the fund manager is doing commercial paper or investing in equities, your outcome or the resources you will get out of that, the return you will get out of that, is based on the performance of the portfolio. So you're not necessarily guaranteed a given amount.
Okay.
I hope you understand that, because you could make outsized returns for which nobody is at risk, or you have earned a certain return on the portfolio, or below that. So that's a difference that we want to emphasize.
Okay. How about those with the collective investment schemes? Because I know there are those who invested directly in these funds, and there are those who invested through the collective investment schemes. What is the arrangement for those people? So
for the collective investment schemes, we actually wrote to their directors, and we informed them to appoint managers, because they operate as separate entities. They actually one might call them special purpose vehicles, because they are incorporated. They have either directors or trustees. Well, a unit trust might be a bit different from a mutual fund. Mutual funds are normally a company, limited by shares. So out of the 18 firms, 13 actually have appointed fund managers.
Okay.
We've announced it on our website. The remaining 5, one of them is actually going through liquidation. It was going through liquidation even before the revocation. Okay. So that process is also ongoing. We're encouraging the trustee to ensure the funds are released to the unit trust holders. The remaining 4, they've communicated to us some are saying they're making progress. They got some fund managers, but then they pulled out at the last minute. Okay. So then they'll have to appoint a new fund manager.
So that has been handled, right?
That is being handled.
Okay, so we are just wrapping up. We don't have a lot of time. My very final question. When is the liquidation process starting and when is it ending? And when are we going to receive payments? Okay.
So I think in terms of the liquidations, we've actually gotten 2 court orders for the liquidation. There are a few that are scheduled for hearing tomorrow, actually. Okay. And Friday in the courts. Okay. And then a few also next week. Okay. So those hearings are going on now, and we are hoping to get our orders. Okay.
So there's no date. There's no date as we speak.
Exactly. Okay. They happen as we are getting the orders. Okay. But we are in talks with the government on the bailout structure. Okay. And we hope to announce something along those lines in the next few weeks as well.
In the next few weeks. Mr. Polabebiu, we are grateful that you made time to speak with us. I'm really hoping that the liquidation process will start as soon as possible and so that especially pensioners can have access to their funds. Mr. Polabebiu is the Deputy Director General of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I hope he was able to answer some of your questions, but if you are yet to make your claim, you can call 0800 100 065, 0800 100 065.
1,000.
Okay, 1, so 0800 1065, 0800 1065, or go to revocations@sec.gov.gh, revocations@sec.gov.gh, or info@sec.gov.gh, and put in your claims, and I'm sure it will be resolved. There's more coming up on New Day. Don't go away.